Data architecture, selectivity threshold explained. Welcome to another video in the data architecture series. We've been talking about SOCL performance, retrieving records out of an object, an S object, standard or custom. And we talked in a previous video, we started to learn about the query plan tool for seeing performance. We learned about the query optimizer, which is the equivalent of a librarian that's making a choice as to the best way to get those records. And then in a previous video, I talked about what an index is. We talked about indexes on standard objects, and we talked about standard indexes, which come on custom and standard objects. And we also talked about that you can get custom indexes applied to certain fields. And in another video, we're building these building blocks. In another video, I talked about having the equivalent of what is asking for the data in a selective manner. And so we're going to quickly scan over that, but then we're going to be diving into this video about another factor that's involved, which is called selectivity threshold. And what that means is when the query optimizer, the librarian, is trying to decide whether to get the data. You ask for the data, give me all the records in Arizona. And the query optimizer, the librarian, has a card index, an index file. And it says, should I use that index? They're asking for the records from Arizona. Now, if you had a widely distributed population, and by filtering by Arizona, that would limit the set, then the query optimizer is going to use the index. But if all you had was a data of people only in Arizona, then essentially it could have 1 million people in Arizona in the S object, and you're saying filter by Arizona, it's going to gain no performance. And in fact, going to the indexes would actually slow it down. So in that case, the query optimizer is not going to use the index. So when not only does it check to see if there's an index, and are you asking for it in a selective manner, the query optimizer counts the number of records, both total records in the object and for that specific clause, name or state equals Arizona, is there too many proportion? What is the proportion? And that proportion is called the selectivity threshold. So it's going to look at the total population of records, and it's going to come based on that. It has rules for determining the maximum amount of records that could be returned by this clause and deciding whether it can use it. So we're going to walk into those details. It's different for standard indexes and different for custom indexes. So just to refresh, the card catalog is the equivalent of an index. And we're going to be doing querying, fetching the data, and then there's the equivalent of a table scan. There are standard indexes. This is very important. There are standard indexes that Salesforce has built into the system. And on custom objects and standard objects, here are the standard indexes. You can ask Salesforce to create custom indexes in certain situations. And this is important in today's conversation, that there is a difference between these two, standard and custom. And we talked about the index tables. And then I said in a previous video that you had to ask in a selective manner. And what we're now talking about is the selectivity threshold, where the data can affect performance. So low volumes of data may perform because of the selectivity threshold, and higher numbers of records may affect the selectivity threshold. So this is important. So selectivity threshold is a criteria the query must meet to consider using an index. So what you have is you're going to have primary indexes and standard indexes and custom indexes. So we're going to be looking at a standard index. So a standard index it has the ratio. There is what's called a threshold. And the limit is 30% of the first 1 million records and 15% of the records above 1 million, with a maximum of 1 million. And this threshold is the maximum number of records that could be retrieved if it were to use the index. So if you had 1 million records, and you were asking for them in Arizona, only 1/3 of that could be in Arizona. Otherwise, you've exceeded it. It's not worth going to the index. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little grid I put together. So this is a little grid. We got the first million records, which I'm going to say if there were a total of 300,000 records in my, let's say, case object, then it's under 1 million. So I look at the 300. So 30% of that is 90,000. So if I had a total of 300,000 records in my case object, and I said, let's take a look at an example. I had 300,000 cases, and of that, I've got 3,000, let's call it 10,000. 10,000 are closed. So if I were trying to write, and let's assume that this was status is not a closed, but what we're going to be looking at is this is a threshold. So I'm going to change this just to match the examples. So if I were doing select ID name from account where the name is like A, this is a standard index. I'm asking for it in a selective manner. If I had a total of 30,000 records and 10,000 of them started with A, the threshold, let's look at 30,000. So 30,000, my threshold is 9,000. So now this would not be selective because I've exceeded the 9,000 threshold. So there would be too many A's that I'm pulling back. Now, if I were only looking for 1,000 that started with an A, and my threshold was 9,000, then this would be selective. So depending on the number of records that meet this criteria, name like A, and the total number of records, 30,000. So you do 30% of this, which is 9,000, and the record you're looking for is 1,000. So the number you're looking for is less than the threshold, then it's selective. But if I were looking for 9,000, let's say 9,001, this now becomes no, not selective. And if I had a total number of records of 1 million, then my threshold, we're going to go to the standard one, is going to be 30%, which is going to be 300,000. So now my threshold is 300,000. Now I can retrieve up to 300,000 records that had or my condition must match up to 300,000. If there were more than 300,000, let's say there were 400,000 A's, then this would not be selective. So this is an important thing to know, that your data volumes can start low, and then as the ratio of the total records, the records that match, and the threshold, you could reach a point where you could not be able to have a selective index. So it may start selective, and then as your data volumes grow, it becomes unselective. Now we're going to be looking at custom indexes, which are a third of that. So we were at standard index 30%, which had a speed limit of the first million for a total of 1 million max. But now we're going to be looking at custom indexes. Custom indexes are 10% and 5% over the million with a speed limit of 333,000. So what we're going to look at is this grid is now custom, is now different. So in standard indexes, we're going to find, let's take back to standard, we quickly see that our threshold is reached somewhere between 5 and 6 million. 5 and 6 million is where the first million gives me 300,000, and then I cap out at a maximum speed limit of 1,000,000 records. However, we go to custom indexes, the numbers are smaller. It's still the first million, but it's 15% of the first million. And then it's 5% of anything over for a maximum of 333,000 records. So you quickly hit that speed limit, also around 5 million, but you're hitting that speed limit at 333,000 records. So let's take a look at this, and we're going to switch this one to be ID and status, which would be a custom index from case. Now looking in the org, you can go into the object manager and you can see which fields are indexed. It's right here. And if you look at the case status, it is indexed. So this makes, and this is a sandbox that I've not requested any indexing. So therefore, we're going to look at this case status for a this now hits the thresholds of a standard index. So status where status is closed. Now, an important consideration is right now, if you have a total of 1,000,000 records, and that's a standard field, and case status is closed, hits 50,000, we look at our threshold. Our million threshold on a standard index is 300,000. So that becomes indexable, selective. But what you need to watch is if your closed cases rise, and I would hope that if you had 1,000,000 total cases, that your threshold, you would close a lot of them. So if out of the 1,000,000, 800,000 were closed, then this would not be selective. So what you need to realize is at some point, your closed case SOCL query will not become selective anymore with just the status equals closed. So what you're going to need to realize is that as the ratio of closed cases rise, that it may not be selective. So you may have a system that as the records grow, it'll slow down. But if your ratios and your queries are within the threshold, it could stay fast. But as soon as the ratios change, it could get slow again. So if you had a case status of open, this would be performant until your case opens exceed your threshold. So, and at some point, if you had 10 million cases, let's go 10. So here's 10 million cases. You're going to hit the threshold of 1 million. So at some point, once you exceed 1 million cases, you're going to suddenly find that even an open case filter will not perform. For custom indexes, it's 1/3. So it's the first 100,000, 15%, leading to a total of 333. This is actually the hardest part of getting the performance, is just learning these two grids. So if you're studying for the data architect exam, you just need to remember a couple of numbers. The first 1,000,000 records, standard index versus custom. The first 1,000,000 records with its first threshold. The second, any records over, and they have to stay under. So for standard, it's 30% up to the first 1,000,000, 15% of that going up to 333,000 records. So let me restate that. Standard indexes, the first million up to 30%, and anything over a million would be the 15% for the remaining up to the maximum amount of 1 million. And then for the custom indexes, it's that first million is at 15%, and the remaining millions at the remaining over the first million at 5%, up to 333,000. You just get these numbers for the exam and just realize that as the ratios of your numbers change, that it could cause your performance to change. Focus on that. Let me show you the help text articles. So here's an article making SQL queries selective. And what I want you to focus in on for a standard index, the threshold is 30% of the first million and 15% after that. And it maxes out at 1 million total records. For a custom index, the selectivity threshold is 10% of the first million and 5% after the first million and maxes out 333. Once you learn these formulas, they tell you just think of all the records in us, like all the accounts, and if they were all in one locale, if there were too many concentrated and you were trying to use that filter as the query, then it just won't be effective. Or if you're trying to query closed cases and there's a huge portion of closed cases, it won't work. And at some point, even your open cases, if you get a large volume of open cases, it may not work. And what I mean may not work is that index will be, the selectivity threshold will be exceeded, and the query optimizer will not use that index. Now we'll talk in other videos about how other potential clauses in your statement might kick in. So this was one of the most, tedious of the data architect, but if you should be able to focus in on that and get it. So thank you for sticking around for Thresholds for Speed. Join me again, same bat time, same bat channel. Have a great day.